For nearly my entire life, I believed the universe was a place that rewarded discipline, logic, and patience. I believed that if you looked long enough, measured precisely enough, and questioned carefully enough, every mystery would eventually unravel. Not because the cosmos is simple, but because it is consistent, predictable, governed by laws older than stars, older than time itself. That belief shaped everything I became. It shaped the scientist I was, the educator I tried to be, the father, the colleague, the man who dedicated decades to the tireless pursuit of truth written in equations. But as I stand here now, facing what we have witnessed, facing the chaos that has swept through the scientific community like a silent wildfire, I must begin with the sentence I never imagined would leave my lips. We were wrong, completely, absolutely, fundamentally wrong. I didn't arrive at that realization overnight. None of us did. For years, the confidence in our own understanding shielded us from doubt, from fear. We thought we were mapping a universe that behaved, that respected the limits we assigned it. Relativity, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, our holy trinity of certainty. But certainty has a way of blinding even the sharpest minds. It comforts you, caresses your ego, tells you that the world is understandable if only you keep studying it. And so we studied, we mapped, we measured, until a single anomaly slipped quietly into the edges of our detection range and began dismantling everything we held sacred. It began the way many cosmic discoveries begin, with a faint smear of light on a sensor, a small, unremarkable smudge drifting across the data feed from one of our deep sky telescopes. It wasn't bright, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't accompanied by fanfare or panic. It was simply new. And because everything new demands a label, we gave it one: comet. A harmless, familiar, comfortable comet wandering in from interstellar space. The designation helped us breathe easier. It helped us feel in control. Comets are old friends, dirty snowballs that flare and crumble as they approach the sun. Predictable, harmless, obedient to gravity's ancient hand. For a while, this assumption held us together. But assumptions are fragile things. The first anomaly was small enough to ignore, a brightness fluctuation that didn't match the expected curve. The object brightened too fast, then dimmed too sharply. We blamed ice pockets, shadowing effects, rotational irregularity. The second anomaly was even more subtle, a deviation of only a few milliseconds in its projected path, a tiny drift. We told ourselves it was noise in the data or a misalignment in our tracking algorithm. The third anomaly, however, refused to be dismissed. Its chemical spectrum, initially assumed to be rich in water ice, showed nothing of the sort. It lacked the most fundamental signature shared by every comet ever recorded in human history. But instead of questioning the premise, we modified the model. We added new variables. We told ourselves nature was simply being more creative than usual. I can see now how absurd that was. I can see how desperately we clung to our categories, our labels, our comfort. We patched the holes in our theories like sailors trying to hold together a sinking ship with scraps of rope and prayers. Every new inconsistency was treated as a solvable glitch, a misunderstanding that would disappear under the magnifying glass of better data. But with each new observation, the universe pushed back harder, tearing at the seams of our certainty. The object, what we would eventually call 4I Helix, was not behaving like anything we had seen before. It lurched. It pulsed. It drifted in ways gravity alone could not explain. Its coma didn't diffuse like vaporizing ice. It sharpened in geometric patterns that nature simply does not produce. Still, we insisted it was natural. Still, we insisted we understood. That denial was our downfall. The turning point, the moment everything shifted, came nearly 6 months after its discovery. The object had moved into a region of space where the sun's gravitational pull was strong, irresistible, domineering. According to every law of celestial mechanics, its velocity should have increased. A simple rule: when you fall toward a massive body, you accelerate. Even children understand this. But 4I Helix did not accelerate. It slowed down. Not by micrometers per second, not by a rounding error. It decelerated with intent, with consistency, with a precision so unnatural that the first team to report it requested verification from 3 independent observatories before daring to release the preliminary findings. We tried everything, every explanation, every patch, every theory. Outgassing? Impossible. Solar radiation pressure? Too weak. Drag from an unknown medium? Nonsense. For a comet to slow down in a sustained, controlled manner requires one thing and one thing only: propulsion. The word none of us dared to say at the time. But even propulsion was only the beginning. High-resolution imaging came next. A handful of frames captured by orbiting telescopes, blurry but distinct enough to ignite chaos in every lab that saw them. The surface of 4I Helix was not jagged. It was not rough. It was not the chaotic terrain of a fractured ancient object. It was patterned, structured, a lattice of interlocking hexagons stretching across its midsection with a precision that no natural process could justify. Perfect circles, identical in diameter, carved along what appeared to be equatorial lines, smooth cylindrical protrusions rising from its core like engine nozzles or antenna arrays. Engineers saw machinery, astronomers saw impossibility. Physicists saw a problem so immense it felt like a personal attack. The debates became heated. Careers hung in the balance. Some researchers accused others of doctoring the images. Others accused the telescopes of malfunctioning. A few whispered, quietly, fearfully, that we might be looking at something built, something manufactured, something designed. But such ideas were academic suicide, so they stayed whispered, buried beneath decades of training that insisted on natural explanations first. Then the spectrum data arrived. Not water, not methane, not ammonia. In fact, not a single molecule that should exist on a comet was present in any significant quantity. Instead, the object was composed almost entirely of carbon dioxide ice, nearly 98% by volume. Impossible. The cold regions of interstellar space produce water ice naturally and abundantly. CO2 in these quantities is not just unusual, it contradicts every known model of planet and comet formation. It violates the chemistry of star nurseries. It violates the thermodynamics of dust clouds. It violates everything. That was the moment the first crack formed in our collective facade, a crack that widened with every passing day. Because sometimes the universe doesn't whisper, sometimes it screams. The final blow of that first phase came unexpectedly. A sudden burst of reflected light, sharp, pulsed, rhythmic, aligned perfectly with minute shifts in the object's rotation. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic, it wasn't natural, it was signaling. Whether to itself, to its fragments, or to something else we could not yet imagine, we didn't know. But it was deliberate. And in that moment, staring at those pulses on a monitor in a darkened lab, surrounded by colleagues who looked as pale and terrified as I felt, I understood the truth that had been chasing us for months. We were not watching a comet. We were watching behavior. And behavior belongs to something alive, something engineered, or something far more terrifying than either. For weeks after the first pulse was detected, we lived in a state of suspended disbelief, half terror, half awe. Every new fragment of data was like another crack spreading through a dam we had spent our entire careers reinforcing. The object we had once labeled a comet was shedding that label piece by piece, stripping it from our hands no matter how desperately we tried to cling to it. Deep down, every scientist who stared at those rhythmic flashes knew what they meant. But saying it aloud meant stepping into a new reality, one we had no vocabulary for, no framework to navigate. And so we hesitated. We told ourselves it was a glitch, a quirk, a transient artifact. But the universe had no patience for our denial. Helix, yes, we were finally calling it that, began to fracture. It started with a violent structural shear detected by multiple observatories. A section of the object's outer shell cracked open, scattering pieces into the surrounding vacuum. At first, we celebrated quietly. Fragmentation is what comets do. It was the first normal thing this object had exhibited since the day we discovered it. Finally, a sign, however small, that nature was still in control. We expected the pieces to drift away chaotically, each following its own independent trajectory. Dead rubble obeys gravity and inertia. It does not think. It does not organize. It does not choose. But the fragments did not drift. They formed a line. A narrow, delicate ribbon trailing behind the primary core, moving with a degree of synchronization no natural debris field could ever achieve. When the main body slowed by even a fraction of a meter per second, the fragments adjusted. When it shifted its orientation by barely a degree, the fragments subtly repositioned themselves, tightening or relaxing their formation with a choreography that felt intentional. Observatories across Europe, Chile, and the United States confirmed it independently. Every set of eyes, every telescope, every analyst saw the same impossible dance. And for the first time, silence fell over the scientific community. Not confusion, not argument, not debate, silence, because no one had an explanation left to offer. I remember standing in the control room at JPL, staring at the synchronized movement of those fragments, tiny specks on a wide projection screen, and feeling my chest tighten. It felt like I was watching a school of fish follow a leader, or fighter jets locking into formation behind a command ship. That realization settled into the room slowly, like fog. No one dared to speak it, but everyone felt it pressing against their minds. This was not a comet. This was a system. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly, not from a telescope, but from a radio array in Western Australia, a network designed to study the earliest whispers of the cosmos. They weren't listening for local anomalies. They weren't listening for anything nearby at all. And yet there it was, a faint modulation in the sunlight reflected off Helix's surface. Not radio waves, not a traditional transmission. It was something subtler, an encoded rhythm hidden within the polarization of light itself. It pulsed with a mathematical consistency, a harmonic structure that repeated cyclically, shifting only when the fragments altered their positions or when the core rotated. At first we assumed it was sensor contamination, then a computational misalignment. But the modulation appeared again and again and again in data from different nights, different angles, different instruments. It was real, it was coherent, and most disturbingly, it responded. When the fragments tightened their formation, the modulation sharpened. When the primary core drifted, the frequency shifted. It was as if Helix were broadcasting a diagnostic signal, a status check, a self-assessment, a kind of luminous heartbeat. Some researchers whispered a more terrifying possibility. The modulation resembled a scanning pattern, something mapping its environment, analyzing the solar wind, evaluating internal damage. A few suggested it might be searching for something or someone, but we still tried, painfully, pathetically, to hold on to natural explanations. Nature does not generate harmonically layered modulation as a response to its own structural changes. Nature does not coordinate the motion of debris with millisecond precision. Nature does not slow itself down deliberately against the pull of a star. Helix was behaving, and behavior implies agency. The moment everything collapsed came 6 days after the modulation discovery. It was subtle at first, just a deviation in Helix's expected orbit of less than 1/10 of a degree. But that deviation grew, bending its path into a new direction entirely, like a ship adjusting course. NASA analysts recalculated the trajectory 6 times, then 12. The numbers refused to align with any natural force. Helix wasn't drifting, it wasn't falling, it wasn't decaying, it was navigating. Worse, it was navigating with purpose. The new vector aligned it perfectly with a high-energy solar wind front moving through the heliosphere, a front so distant that no natural body could anticipate it. Yet Helix turned toward it like a creature positioning itself to feed, or like a machine aligning itself with a power source. The fragments behind it adjusted instantly, tightening formation as if preparing for whatever came next. And then, as if it wished to leave no room for doubt, Helix executed another maneuver. It dipped, a tiny, elegant dip, precise, controlled, unmistakably intentional. Every tracking station around the globe saw it. A coordinated deceleration followed by a pivot that aligned it closer to Earth's orbital plane. Not at Earth, not toward collision, but toward proximity, toward observation, toward us. That was when fear replaced wonder. Because no matter how much we pretended otherwise, we all knew what it meant for an unknown object to slow down, adjust its course, synchronize its fragments, and move into a strategic orbit near our planet. It was aware. Aware of the sun, aware of the solar wind, aware of its own damage, aware of its fragments, aware of its path, and most horrifying of all, aware of us. Every agency, every observatory, every scientific institution entered a phase of silent panic. Private channels lit up with encrypted discussions, each message more frantic than the last. Government task forces formed. Emergency scientific committees convened. Public statements were carefully worded, sterile, cautious. No one dared to tell the world what the data was screaming. Helix was not a random visitor. Helix was not a natural anomaly. Helix was not an accident of the universe. It had chosen to remain. It had chosen its orbit. It had chosen its behavior. And as the rhythmic pulses continued, denser now, tighter, more structured, one chilling question began to surface as the only question that mattered. If Helix is signaling, who is the signal meant for? In the days that followed Helix's shift into its new orbit, a kind of collective paralysis settled over every scientific institution on the planet. Not because we lacked data, we had more data than we could process. Not because we lacked evidence. The evidence was undeniable. No, what froze us was the crushing realization that every framework we had used to interpret the universe was collapsing at once. We were staring at something with intention, something with coordination, something with awareness. And no textbook, no model, no law of physics was equipped to tell us what it meant. The pulses intensified. Not brighter, not louder, but clearer, cleaner. Their harmonic spacing grew more refined, as if the object were narrowing its focus, sharpening its voice. At first, we thought it was a distress signal, maybe an automated system struggling to compensate for damage. But then something changed. The pulses began to repeat in fixed intervals, not tied to rotation, not tied to fragment movement, not tied to any environmental variable. They were rhythmic, deliberate. They had cadence. Some of my colleagues insisted it was communication. Others argued, almost desperately, that we were projecting patterns where none existed. But doubt was a dying luxury, especially after the event that silenced even the most stubborn skeptics. Helix's fragments shifted again, but this time not to realign with the core. They formed a shape, a deliberate geometrical configuration, a narrow arc opening toward the sun, almost like a receiving array. Each piece positioned itself with angular precision, spacing consistent to within a few meters. The formation wasn't random. It wasn't the result of gravitational play. It was a structure, a formation with purpose, built from the debris of its own fractured shell. And as that structure locked into place, the pulses changed again. Higher frequency, tighter intervals, a clarity that seemed to hum with intention. It wasn't calling for help. It wasn't calling to its fragments. It was trying to be heard. We knew then that silence was no longer neutral. Silence meant ignorance, or worse, indifference. But responding meant something far more dangerous. Any signal we sent would reveal our level of technology, our understanding of the cosmos, our capability, or lack thereof. A reckless reply could be interpreted as aggression, a timid one as weakness, a loud one as desperation. But the greatest danger was the possibility that Helix already understood us, that it had been studying us long before we even realized it was here. And so the world waited. Agencies argued. Governments panicked behind closed doors. Scientists debated ethics, strategy, philosophy. We held private symposiums, rooms filled with the brightest minds humanity had ever produced, and we found ourselves powerless, because no one knew what we were dealing with. Was it a vessel, a probe, a relic, a life form, or something that shattered all those definitions at once? Three possibilities rose above the chaos, each one more terrifying than the last. First, the machine hypothesis. If Helix was a craft, then every maneuver, every pulse, every formation was intentional engineering. The deceleration was a controlled burn. The fragments were drones or components. The modulation was communication. If this was true, then an intelligence greater than ours had parked something in our solar system on purpose. Second, the organism hypothesis. A being. Not in the biological sense we understand, but a vast, self-regulating structure capable of movement, self-repair, and environmental awareness. In that framework, the fragments were limbs, the pulses were neural signals, the deceleration was a metabolic adaptation. If this was true, then life in the universe was far more diverse, far more alien than we dared imagine. Third, the possibility none of us wanted to discuss, that Helix was neither machine nor life, but a manifestation of some higher cosmic architecture, a construct of physics beyond our reach, a hybrid of matter and information, a phenomenon designed by a universe far more complex than the one in our textbooks. If this was true, then we weren't dealing with an object at all. We were dealing with a principle, a messenger, a piece of something older than stars. But beyond all these theories, one fact remained constant, undeniable. Helix had chosen proximity to Earth, not collision, not avoidance, proximity. It orbited in a rhythm that brought it near our planet with deliberate periodicity, like a lighthouse sweeping its beam across the same stretch of ocean again and again. It was watching, observing, studying, waiting. And whatever it was waiting for, it had not yet found. On the 15th day after its major course correction, something happened that I will never forget. The pulses stopped, completely. For the first time since their discovery, Helix fell silent. The fragments held position. The structure remained intact. Everything froze in perfect stillness. And then one single pulse, not modulated, not layered, not coded, just one, bright enough that telescopes across the world recorded it simultaneously, sharp enough that our instruments clipped their own readings, long enough to feel intentional, short enough to suggest restraint. It was a knock, a question, a prompt. It was asking. And in that moment, the weight of the entire universe pressed against us, because this wasn't a comet. It wasn't a curiosity. It wasn't a visitor drifting through our cosmic neighborhood. It was a presence, a mind, a message. Helix was waiting for a reply, and now humanity must decide, not as nations or institutions or scientific factions, but as a species. Do we answer? Do we stay silent? Do we dare acknowledge a neighbor we never asked for? The future of our world, our civilization, our place in the vastness of the cosmos depends on what we choose now, not in centuries, not in decades, now. While Helix watches from above, patient and unreadable. We were wrong about the universe. We were wrong about our certainty. We were wrong to believe we were alone. And whether we are ready or not, the universe has finally knocked on our door. Helix is waiting.